The last thing my son ever said to me inside my own house was, "Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be." I remember looking down at the coffee mug in my hands. It still had my fingerprints on it. Funny, because 30 minutes later, apparently nothing else in that house belonged to me anymore. I've worked construction my entire life. 41 years. Broken ribs. 2 knee surgeries. Hands that can't fully close anymore. I buried my wife. Paid every bill on time. Never asked my son for a single dollar. So tell me, how does a man walk out to buy a loaf of bread and come home to find strangers carrying his furniture onto the lawn? That's the question I asked myself 3 years ago. It took me exactly 947 days to learn the answer. And when I finally did, my son begged me not to tell anyone. I didn't. I just made sure everyone found out anyway. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because none of this started with a house. It started with one sentence that sounded like love. Before I knew I was being replaced, my name is Thomas Bennett. If you ever drove through Ashford, Kentucky, there's a decent chance you drove across something I helped build. Bridges, schools, fire stations, the public library, even the football stadium. I wasn't the guy whose name went on the sign. I was the guy making sure the sign didn't fall over. That was enough for me. You learn something after 40 years in construction. Concrete tells the truth. People, not so much. I met my wife, Linda, when I was 23. She said my boots were too muddy to be standing in a grocery store. I told her I'd just spent 12 hours pouring a foundation. She looked at me for about 5 seconds, then smiled. "I guess I'll forgive you this once." 40 years later, she still reminded me of that story every anniversary. I miss that laugh more than I know how to explain. When Linda passed away, the house became quiet, not empty. Quiet, there's a difference. Every room still sounded like her somehow. The kitchen, the back porch, even the hallway where she'd yell because I left my boots by the front door. Some nights, I'd leave them there on purpose, just to imagine hearing her complain one more time. My son, Ethan, started visiting more after the funeral. At least, that's what I believed. Every Saturday, every Sunday, sometimes Wednesday evenings, he'd mow the lawn before I even asked, bring groceries, fix little things around the house, replace light bulbs, check the smoke detectors. He even started calling me every morning. "Morning, Dad. Take your medicine? Need anything?" If you've ever been alone after losing someone, you know what those phone calls feel like somebody remembered you're still here. I thought I had the best son in the world. Turns out he wasn't checking on me. He was checking how much longer I'd be living alone. I didn't realize it then. Neither would you. Because if someone wants to betray you, they almost never begin by hurting you. They begin by making you feel safe. One afternoon, about 6 months after Linda's funeral, Ethan showed up carrying a leather folder. Nothing unusual. He worked in finance. He always had folders. He set it on my kitchen table, poured us both coffee, didn't rush, didn't pressure me, just smiled. "Dad, can we talk about something?" I said, "Sure." He slid the folder toward me. "It's just paperwork." If I had opened it, read every page, asked one more question, this story would have ended right there. Instead, I reached for a pen. The paper my son called just paperwork gave him the legal right to do something I never imagined possible. And I wouldn't discover it until I couldn't even unlock my own front door. You know what's strange? I've replayed that afternoon in my head hundreds of times. Not because I couldn't remember it, because I remembered every single detail. The smell of fresh coffee, the rain tapping against the kitchen window, the way my son smiled while pushing that folder toward me. If evil had a face that day, it looked exactly like kindness. Ethan wasn't in a hurry. That's the part that still bothers me. People who are lying usually rush. He didn't. He leaned back in Linda's old kitchen chair, took a sip of coffee, and started talking about my future. "Dad," he said, "you've been handling everything alone for a long time." I nodded. "So?" He smiled. "I've just been thinking, what happens if you fall again?" That question landed harder than he probably intended. 3 months earlier, I'd slipped while cleaning the gutters. Nothing serious, bruised shoulder, stiff back. But word travels fast when you're 70, apparently faster than pride. "I'll manage," I told him. He chuckled. "I know you will. But that's not the point." He tapped the folder. "This is just protection." Funny thing about the word protection. Sometimes, the thing that promises to protect you ends up being the thing you need protection from. But I didn't know that yet. Ethan opened the folder. Every page had little colored tabs. Yellow, blue, green, professional, neat. Exactly the kind of paperwork you'd expect from someone who planned everything. I talked to our attorney. He said it so casually, like he was telling me he'd stopped by the hardware store. He suggested we get a few things organized. I laughed. "Organized?" He grinned. "Come on, Dad, you're still keeping important papers in that old metal filing cabinet from the 80s. He wasn't wrong. Birth certificates, insurance, Linda's recipes, the house deed. Everything was in that cabinet. If it mattered, it was inside those rusty drawers." "You've always taken care of everything," Ethan continued. "I'm just trying to make things easier. If you've ever lost someone, you know how exhausting ordinary life becomes. Every little decision feels heavier. You don't realize how much another person carried until they're gone. So when someone you love offers to carry a little of that weight, you don't question it. You thank them." I thanked him. He pointed to one page. "This one's just in case you're ever in the hospital. Another, this one's medical. Another, this one's banking. Another, emergency decisions." Everything sounded reasonable. Everything sounded responsible. Everything sounded like something a good son would do. Looking back, I only asked one question. Just one. I wish I'd asked 10. I looked at him. "You're not planning on putting me in a nursing home, are you?" He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "Dad, no, you'd burn the place down before the first week was over." I laughed too, because that's exactly what Linda would have said. For one tiny moment, it felt like she was sitting there with us again. Sometimes memories make you lower your guard. That's what they did to me. Ethan slid a pen across the table. "Whenever you're ready." I didn't read every page. I know some of you listening are already yelling at me. Read the paperwork, Tom. Believe me, I've yelled that at myself for 3 years. But here's something people don't tell you about trust. Trust isn't built in one afternoon. It's built over decades. I wasn't signing papers handed to me by a stranger. I was signing papers handed to me by the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder every Sunday after church. The same kid who cried when he scraped his knees. The same teenager who asked me to teach him how to drive my old pickup. The same young man who stood beside me at Linda's funeral, holding me up when I thought my legs might give out. How many fathers look at their own son and think maybe he's setting a trap? I signed. 1 page, then another, then another. He gathered everything neatly back into the folder, smiled, reached across the table, and squeezed my shoulder. "Thanks, Dad, I'll take care of everything." Those 6 words, "I'll take care of everything." For almost 40 years, that's what fathers say to sons. That afternoon, my son said them to me, and somehow I didn't hear the warning hidden inside them. Life went on. Weeks turned into months. Nothing changed, or at least, nothing I could see. I kept fishing every Saturday morning, still met Frank for breakfast every Tuesday, still mowed my own lawn, still argued with the neighbor about whose tomatoes were better, still forgot to buy milk almost every other week. Life felt normal, which is exactly what made it so dangerous. Because while I was busy living my life, someone else was quietly preparing to take it away. It happened 8 months later, on a Tuesday, at exactly 9:17 in the morning. My phone rang. The woman on the other end said just one sentence. "Mr. Bennett, we need to verify that you approved the transfer of your property." I laughed. I actually laughed, because I thought she had the wrong number. I had no idea she was talking about my house. One phone call, one signature. One house that legally wasn't mine anymore, even though I was still sleeping in it every night. Build trust in Ethan before the betrayal. Add emotional realism through memories of Linda. Keep viewers engaged with recurring open loops. End on a major revelation without resolving it, creating a strong reason to continue into Chapter 3 while creating 3 new ones. The woman sounded embarrassed, like she wasn't sure she should even be calling me. "Mr. Bennett?" "Yes?" "I'm sorry to bother you. We're just required to verify one last time before everything is finalized." I frowned. "Finalized?" "Yes, sir, the transfer of your property." I actually smiled, not because it was funny, because I genuinely believed she'd called the wrong person. "I'm afraid you've got the wrong Tom Bennett." There was a pause. Then I heard papers being shuffled. "No, sir, Thomas Edward Bennett, Maple Ridge Road, white farmhouse, 3-bedroom, detached workshop." My smile disappeared. Yes, that's my house. Wonderful, then we're all set. We already have your signed authorization. I just needed verbal confirmation. Signed authorization. Those two words wouldn't leave my head. Signed authorization. I hadn't signed anything. At least, nothing about selling my house. Had I? Memory does strange things when fear walks into the room. You start replaying conversations, searching for missing pieces, tiny details, words that didn't matter yesterday suddenly become everything. Then, like someone turning on a light, I remembered the folder, the paperwork, the coffee, the pen. A cold feeling settled in my stomach, not panic, not yet. Something quieter. The feeling you get when your brain knows the truth a few seconds before your heart is ready to believe it. I asked the woman, "Who requested this transfer?" Silence. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't disclose client information." Client, not owner. Client, that single word bothered me more than anything else she'd said. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at my kitchen wall for what felt like forever. You ever notice how a house sounds different the moment you stop feeling safe inside it? The refrigerator seemed louder. The old clock Linda loved suddenly sounded like a hammer. Tick, tick, tick. Every second felt like it was counting down to something I couldn't see. I walked over to that old filing cabinet, the same rusty one Ethan always teased me about, pulled open the bottom drawer, reached for the folder labeled House. It wasn't there. I frowned. Checked the second drawer. Nothing. Top drawer. Nothing. Then I started pulling everything out. Insurance papers, tax returns, Linda's recipes, old birthday cards, receipts from 20 years ago. Everything. The folder was gone. Now, maybe you're thinking Ethan borrowed it. That's exactly what I told myself, because our brains don't jump to betrayal. Not when the person we're talking about is our own child. They search for innocent explanations first. I picked up my phone. Called Ethan. Straight to voicemail. No problem. He was probably working. I texted him. Call me when you get a minute. No reply. An hour passed. Nothing. Another hour. Nothing. By dinner, still nothing. That was unusual. Not impossible, just unusual. For months, he'd called almost every day. Now, silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I thought I'd lost the house, because I couldn't imagine Ethan lying to me. I kept remembering him at 9 years old. He'd accidentally broken Linda's favorite vase. He cried harder than she did, kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Linda hugged him, looked at me, and whispered, "Tom, if we raise him to tell the truth when it's hard, he'll become a good man." She believed that. So did I. Maybe that's why what happened next hurt so much. It didn't just break my trust. It made me question 40 years of being a father. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. Honestly, I expected this whole thing to be a misunderstanding, a paperwork mix-up, wrong address, wrong file, something simple. The woman behind the counter smiled. "How can I help you?" I'd like to check the title on my property. No problem. She typed for a few seconds, stopped, looked at the screen, then looked back at me. You are Thomas Bennett? Yes, she hesitated, long enough for my heartbeat to speed up. I'm sorry. According to our records, you're no longer the owner. Those words didn't make sense. Not emotionally, not logically, not legally. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain rejects reality before your heart can. There has to be a mistake. She turned the monitor toward me. There it was. Property transfer. Recorded, approved, completed, and at the bottom, under owner's signature, was my name. My signature. I stared at it for nearly a minute. Then I noticed something so small, the woman at the counter never even realized why my face had changed. It wasn't the signature. The signature was mine. It was the date. The transfer had been signed on the exact same afternoon Ethan brought me coffee and called it just paperwork. I still believed there had to be a mistake. I had no idea the biggest betrayal wasn't that my house had been transferred, it was who now legally owned it. Retention triggers include cold call mystery in the opening. Missing deed folder creates a tangible clue. Unanswered texts and calls increase suspicion. Emotional flashback deepens the father's bond with Ethan, making the betrayal more painful. County records reveal confirms the impossible. Final twist pays off the previous chapter while opening a much bigger question. Who owns the house now, and why? This kind of answer one question, raise three more structure, is what keeps viewers watching chapter after chapter. Perfect. Now we're entering what I call the no-return zone. This is where most storytelling channels make a mistake. They dump all the exposition. We're not going to do that. We're going to give the audience one devastating answer while planting an even bigger mystery. There's no way his own son did that. People think betrayal happens the moment someone lies to you. They're wrong. The betrayal happens the moment you realize the lie has been living beside you for months, maybe years, and you were the only one who didn't know. I couldn't stop staring at that computer screen. My signature, my address, my property. Everything looked normal, except for one line. Current owner. I swallowed, looked at the woman behind the counter. Who owns it now? She clicked once, twice, then turned the monitor slightly toward herself. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. Sir, I'm really not supposed to comment. That sentence alone told me everything. Whatever she was looking at, she wished I didn't have to see it. I just need the name. She hesitated. Then quietly said, Bennett Family Property Holdings, LLC. At first, I almost felt relieved. Bennett. That was our name. Maybe Ethan had created some kind of family trust. Maybe this really was estate planning. Maybe I'd scared myself over nothing. You see how desperate the mind becomes when it's trying to protect your heart? It'll invent hope just to delay the truth. I asked, who owns the company? She looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry. You'd have to request those records separately. I thanked her, walked back to my truck, closed the door, and just sat there. Linda always said I thought better behind the wheel. Didn't matter if the engine was running. Something about sitting in my old pickup helped me untangle things. That afternoon, nothing untangled. Everything got tighter. I finally reached Ethan around 6. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Dad." His voice sounded normal, too normal. "You busy?" "A little." "Everything okay?" There it was, the question. The same question he'd asked me dozens of times after Linda died. "Everything okay?" I almost said yes. Habit instead, I asked Ethan, "Who owns Bennett Family Property Holdings?" Silence, not static, not a bad connection. "Silence, Ethan. Why are you asking?" I looked out through the windshield. People walked past my truck, laughing, carrying groceries, living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, mine had just stopped. I went to the county office today. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he sighed. The kind of sigh people make when they realize pretending is no longer possible. I was going to explain. Those 5 words, I was going to explain. Have you ever noticed nobody says that until after they've been caught? I didn't yell, didn't accuse him, didn't even raise my voice. I simply asked, "Do you own that company?" "Yes." One word, just one. But somehow it echoed louder than anything I'd ever heard. "You transferred my house to your own company?" "Dad, please let me explain." Explain, funny word. People always want to explain the fire. After the house has already burned down, he started talking. Fast, too fast. "You remember those investment seminars? I told you about protecting assets. This is temporary. It actually saves taxes. You still get to live there." I interrupted him. "Did you ask me?" Silence. "Did you tell me?" Silence again. That was my answer. I leaned my head back against the seat, closed my eyes, and for the first time since Linda died, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, because I wasn't mourning a house. I was mourning certainty. The certainty that my son would never intentionally hurt me. The certainty that family meant safety. The certainty that I'd raised a man whose word meant something. Sometimes, you don't lose faith in people. You lose faith in your own ability to recognize them. After a minute, Ethan spoke again, very softly. "Dad, I never wanted this to happen." I opened my eyes. "What exactly didn't you want to happen? You finding out like this? Not, I'm sorry. Not, I shouldn't have done it. Not, I'll fix it." He was sorry, I found out. That was the moment everything inside me changed. I thought I had finally discovered the whole truth. I hadn't, not even close. Because 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a legal notice. It informed me that the property's new owner had decided to sell the house, and according to the documents, I had exactly 30 days to leave. I thought losing ownership was the worst part. I was wrong, because 30 days later, I would come home carrying groceries, and discover I didn't even own the front door anymore. Retention loops. Who owns the company? Why did Ethan create it? Is this really estate planning? Will he fix it? Why isn't he apologizing? Why is the house being sold? Emotional triggers, false hope, confirmation, quiet grief instead of shouting. The devastating line, "I never wanted you to find out like this." That line tells the audience Ethan knew exactly what he was doing, without ever having to say it outright. Instead of revealing everything at once, the chapter gives the audience just enough to feel the betrayal while ending on a new, urgent threat. Tom has only 30 days before losing his home. That creates immediate forward momentum into Chapter 5, where the emotional and practical consequences finally collide. Now we're entering what I call the emotional explosion arc. That's a mistake. The audience already knows he's losing the house. What they don't know is, how does a son actually watch his own father lose everything? That's where the emotion comes from, because of how cold he becomes. I've been asked one question more than any other. "Tom, why didn't you fight him immediately?" Simple, because I still believed, somewhere, my son would come to his senses. You don't spend 40 years loving someone and stop believing in them after one terrible week. At least, I couldn't. Not yet. The legal notice sat on my kitchen table for 2 days. I must have read it 20 times. Every time, the words looked colder. Notice to vacate. 30 days. Not 30 weeks. Not 30 months. 30 days. 41 years of memories reduced to a deadline. You know what hurt the most? It wasn't the date. It was the return address. Bennett Family Property Holdings, LLC, our family name. Printed at the top. Like Betrayal had opened its own business. I finally called Ethan again. This time, he answered immediately, almost like he'd been expecting it. "Dad, I know why you're calling." "Good, then maybe you already have an answer." Silence. I got the eviction notice. It's not an eviction. I actually laughed. A short laugh, the kind that comes out when something is too ridiculous to argue with. "What would you call it?" He hesitated. "It's just part of the sale. Part of the sale." Listen to those words. Not, "I'm forcing you out." Not, "I'm sorry." Just, "part of the sale." As if my life had become paperwork. "Ethan, look at me." He sighed. "Dad, I'm on the phone. I know. But look at me anyway." Silence. "When your mother was dying, what did she make me promise?" "Nothing," I heard him breathing. Slowly, he remembered. Finally, he whispered, "that you'd always have a home." That's right. And whose home was she talking about? More silence. My home. The one she spent 38 years making. The kitchen she painted 3 different times. The porch where she drank coffee every morning. The garden she planted every spring. That home. Another long silence. Then, something changed in Ethan's voice. Not guilt. Impatience, Dad. You have to stop making this emotional. Stop making it emotional. I looked around my kitchen. Linda's favorite clock. Our wedding picture. The pencil marks on the pantry door where we'd measured Ethan's height every birthday. The old rocking chair she'd refused to throw away. What exactly was I supposed to make emotional if not that? I realized something then. Ethan wasn't looking at a home anymore. He was looking at an asset. Somewhere along the way, the language of business had replaced the language of family. When Ethan was 12, he found an injured robin in our backyard. Wing broken. Couldn't fly. He cried until Linda found a wildlife rescue. For 2 weeks, he woke up every morning before school just to check on that little bird. That's the boy I remembered. So where had he gone? Or had I simply stopped seeing the man he'd become? 3 days later, a realtor knocked on my front door. She couldn't have been older than 30, professional, friendly, completely unaware of what she was walking into. "Mr. Bennett? Yes, I'm so sorry to bother you. I just wanted to schedule photographs for the listing." "The listing?" She looked confused. "The property. We're hoping to put it on the market next week." I stared at her, then looked past her. A photographer was already unloading equipment from a van, tripods, lights, camera bags. They weren't asking if they could come inside. They assumed they could. Have you ever watched strangers admire your life while you were still living inside it? The photographer smiled. "Beautiful porch. These older homes are getting hard to find." Older homes. He didn't know. That porch held the last conversation I ever had with Linda. He didn't know. Every scratch on that hardwood floor had a story. He couldn't know. To him, it was a listing. To me, it was my entire life. The realtor quietly asked, "Would you mind if we started with the living room?" I stepped aside. Not because I wanted to, because I suddenly realized, legally, I no longer had the right to tell them no. That feeling is impossible to describe. Standing inside your own home, feeling like a guest, I watched them straighten Linda's curtains, move family photographs, open windows, talk about natural light, as if sunlight could hide what this house had become. That evening, after everyone left, I walked into the garage, sat on an old wooden stool, and opened the toolbox I'd owned since I was 21. Inside, under decades of wrenches, receipts, and rusty screws, I found something I hadn't seen in years, a sealed envelope, in Linda's handwriting. Across the front, it said only 5 words. "For Tom, if I'm gone." I just stared at it, because suddenly, losing the house didn't feel like the biggest thing I was about to lose anymore. Linda had written that letter 6 months before she died. What she asked me to do next would change everything, not just for me, but for Ethan. That creates a powerful emotional open loop. It also avoids repeating house, house, house by shifting the focus to memories. The emotional meaning of a home. The difference between seeing a home as a family legacy versus a financial asset. I love where this is going, and I also want to point out something important. This is the chapter where most YouTube storytellers fail. They make the dead wife's letter say something cheesy like, "Forgive him," or "Always love your son." That's predictable. We're not doing predictable. We're going to make Linda sound like a real woman, not a plot device. She'll unknowingly leave behind the clue that changes the entire story. That way, the letter isn't just emotional, it moves the plot. People think grief fades. It doesn't. It just gets quieter, like an old radio in another room. Some days, you hardly notice it. Then something small, a song, a smell, a handwritten envelope, turns the volume all the way back up. I sat on that old stool in the garage, holding Linda's letter. Dust covered the corners of the envelope. She must have hidden it there years ago, waiting for a day she hoped would never come. My hands were shaking, not because I was afraid, because I already knew. The last time anyone sealed that envelope, my wife was still alive. I stared at her handwriting for nearly a minute. The same neat cursive she'd used on birthday cards, lunch notes, Christmas presents. "For Tom, if I'm gone." I almost didn't open it. Isn't that strange? After everything I'd lost, I was still afraid of losing one more thing. Sometimes, a letter is the last place a person still feels alive, and once you read it, there are no unread words left. Finally, I slid my thumb under the flap. There was only one page. No long speech, no dramatic goodbye. Just Linda, exactly as she'd always been. She wrote, "Tom, if you're reading this, then you're being stubborn about something. I know you. You'll tell everyone you're fine, even if the whole world is falling apart around you." I smiled. In spite of everything, I smiled. Because she was right. She usually was. The letter continued. "Don't carry every burden by yourself. That's what you've done your whole life, and someday it'll become too heavy." I stopped reading, not because I wanted to, because suddenly I couldn't see the page anymore. Linda hated watching me fix everything alone. If the sink leaked, I'd repair it. If the truck broke down, I'd crawl underneath it. If money got tight, I'd work Saturdays. She'd always say, "Tom, one day you're going to discover there's a difference between being strong and refusing to let people help you." Back then, I thought she was worrying too much. Sitting alone in that garage, I finally understood what she'd meant. I wiped my eyes, kept reading. "There's one more thing. I never told Ethan this, because I wanted to tell you first." I frowned. "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll update the will. Promise me you'll review every legal document together with someone you trust. Not because I don't trust our son, but because people change, and grief changes people even faster." I lowered the paper. "Read that paragraph again. Then again. People change." Linda wrote those words almost a year before she died. Was she worried? Had she noticed something I hadn't? Or was she simply wiser than I ever gave her credit for? The final lines were short, very Linda. "And Tom, if you ever feel completely alone, go see Margaret." Margaret? I whispered the name out loud. Margaret Ellis, Linda's older sister. Not because we'd argued. Life had simply gotten busy. She'd moved across the state after retiring. Christmas cards, birthday calls. That was about it. Why Margaret? Out of everyone Linda knew, why her? I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope. The next morning, I called her. She answered on the second ring. "Tom," her voice immediately softened. "Is everything all right?" Funny how people ask that. Sometimes they already know the answer. I told her everything, not just about the house, everything, the paperwork, the company, the notice, the realtor, the lies. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she was quiet for nearly 30 seconds. Then she asked one question. "Tom, did Linda ever tell you about the blue folder?" My heart skipped. "The what?" "The blue folder. I don't know what you're talking about." Another silence, longer this time. Then she said something that made every hair on my arm stand up. "Tom, if Ethan found that folder before you did, this is much worse than you think." I gripped the phone tighter. "What folder, Margaret?" She took a slow breath. "The one Linda asked me never to mention unless something happened to you." I thought Linda had left me a letter. She hadn't. She'd left me a road map. And hidden somewhere inside my own house was a blue folder my son prayed I'd never find. The audience finally hears Linda's voice, giving them a brief emotional break after several chapters of tension. Instead of ending the letter with generic advice, it introduces the blue folder, a concrete object viewers immediately want to know more about. The story shifts from "my son stole my house" to "what else was hidden?" That widens the mystery and creates fresh momentum. One improvement I'd make before we continue up to this point: the pacing is working well. From Chapter 7 onward, we should begin moving toward the payoff more aggressively. We don't want to stack mystery on mystery without delivering enough answers. A good rhythm for the remaining chapters is Chapter 7, discover the blue folder and reveal a major truth. Chapter 8, Tom starts taking action instead of only reacting. Chapter 9, Ethan's world begins to collapse. Chapter 10, emotional confrontation and a satisfying ending that ties back to the opening. That balance between answers and new questions is what keeps viewers watching without feeling manipulated. This is where we separate ourselves from average storytelling channels. That's boring. We're going to make it contain a weapon. Not a gun, not blackmail. A weapon that fits Tom's character. Truth, documentation, patience. This is the chapter where the audience finally thinks, wait, Tom might actually win this. That emotional shift creates a massive dopamine spike and increases AVD because viewers stop watching out of sympathy and start watching out of anticipation. There's an old saying in construction: measure twice, cut once. Linda used to laugh every time I said it. She'd tease me. "Tom, you treat life like you're building a bridge." Maybe I did. Because one thing I learned after 40 years, a bridge doesn't collapse the day it falls. It starts failing long before anyone notices the first crack. Looking back, the cracks had been there all along. I just kept painting over them. Margaret refused to explain the blue folder over the phone. She only said, "Come tomorrow. I'll show you." The next morning, I drove 3 hours. The entire trip I kept replaying Linda's letter. One sentence wouldn't leave me alone. People change. Had she really seen something in Ethan years before I did? Or was this all coincidence? I honestly didn't know which answer scared me more. Margaret lived in a quiet little farmhouse surrounded by maple trees. The moment she opened the door, she hugged me. Not the polite kind of hug. The kind people save for someone who's been carrying too much for too long. "You've lost weight." I smiled. "I've lost more than that." She nodded. "I know. She made coffee." Of course she did. Linda and Margaret believed every problem in the world deserved coffee first. Lawyers later. For 10 minutes, how she'd laugh so hard she'd snort. How she'd buy flowers even when money was tight. How she could never keep a surprise secret for more than a day. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel angry. I just missed my wife. Then Margaret stood, walked into the hallway, opened an old cedar cabinet, reached behind a stack of photo albums, and pulled out a faded blue folder. She held it carefully, almost respectfully, like it wasn't paper, like it was a promise. "This," she said quietly. "Linda asked me to keep." My heart started pounding. She gave it to me 6 months before she died. I frowned. "Why?" Margaret looked down at the folder, then back at me. "Because she wasn't worried about herself. She was worried about you." Those words hit me harder than I expected. She handed me the folder. Inside, there weren't legal papers. There weren't bank statements. There wasn't a secret will. There was a notebook. Linda's notebook. If you've ever lived with someone for 40 years, you recognize their handwriting instantly, even before you read a single word. The first page simply said, "Things Tom never notices." I laughed. Actually laughed. Margaret laughed too. "That sounds like Linda." "It is." I turned the page. Page after page, small observations. Nothing dramatic. Tom forgets to lock the shed. He always hides cash inside the cookie tin. He pretends not to cry during old movies. If he's worried, he whistles. I smiled through tears. Because every word sounded exactly like her. Then, about halfway through the notebook, everything changed. The heading read, "Things Ethan doesn't know I notice." My smile disappeared. Linda had written dates, conversations, little moments. March 14th. Ethan asked how much the house would be worth after renovations. Tom thought he was making conversation. I don't think he was. Another page. August 2nd. He asked where we kept the deed. When I asked why, he changed the subject. Another, November 18th. He spent 20 minutes looking through the filing cabinet when he thought nobody was watching. When I asked if he needed something, he smiled too quickly. I looked up at Margaret. Neither of us spoke. "You knew?" I whispered. She slowly shook her head. "No," Linda suspected. "There's a difference." I looked back down. The final page wasn't dated. It was written in darker ink, probably near the end of Linda's illness. "If I'm wrong, burn this notebook. Never let Ethan know I doubted him. A mother should never leave suspicion as her legacy. But if I'm right, don't let Tom face this alone." I couldn't breathe for a second. Even dying, she wasn't trying to punish her son. She was trying to protect her husband. Then something slipped from between the pages. A folded receipt, old, yellowed with age. I unfolded it. Not a receipt. A safe deposit box key. Attached was a tiny sticky note. Linda's handwriting. "Tom, if you ever need the truth, start here." I looked at Margaret. She looked back at me. Very quietly, she asked the question neither of us wanted to answer. "Tom, what do you think your son was so afraid you'd eventually find?" The next morning, I stood in front of First County Bank, holding a key that had been waiting for me for almost 4 years. Inside that safe deposit box wasn't money, it wasn't jewelry, it was something far more dangerous. Something that could destroy everything Ethan had spent years building. It gives viewers a heartfelt reunion with Margaret. Linda's personality shining through naturally. A believable reason she kept quiet. Subtle evidence that Ethan's behavior had changed over time. A powerful emotional line. A mother should never leave suspicion as her legacy. And finally, a physical object, the safe deposit key that propels the story into the next act. This is also the point where Tom changes from a passive victim into someone who finally has a path forward. That shift is critical because audiences naturally stay longer once they believe the protagonist has a chance to fight back. Now we reach Act 3. This is where AVD usually either skyrockets or collapses. Why? Because many writers spend chapters 8-10 explaining documents and legal details. Huge mistake. People don't stay for paperwork. They stay for emotion, anticipation, and justice. So this chapter is built around one promise. Tom finally finds something that can change everything. But there are 2 kinds of keys. The kind that open doors and the kind that open the past. I stood outside First County Bank, holding a tiny brass key, wondering which one this was. The bank hadn't changed much. Same brick walls, same old clock over the teller windows. Even the security guard looked familiar. For a second, it felt like any other Thursday, until the manager looked at the key, then looked at my driver's license, and quietly asked, "Miss Bennett, would you like a private room?" Something in his voice told me he already knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary visit. A few minutes later, he unlocked a narrow steel door, walked me into a small room, placed a gray metal box on the table, then left. Just me, the box, and 20 years of questions. I slid the key into the lock, turned it. The lid clicked open. Inside, there wasn't cash. There wasn't jewelry. There weren't stacks of legal papers. There were only 4 things: a photograph, a sealed envelope, a flash drive, and Linda's wedding ring. I stopped breathing for a second. She'd been buried wearing a simple band. I'd never questioned it. I had no idea she'd quietly placed her real ring here years before. Why? I picked up the ring first. Not the envelope. Not the flash drive. The ring. 40 years of marriage can fit into something smaller than a coin. I turned it over. Inside the band, our anniversary date, and 4 words: "Still choosing you." I'd forgotten she'd asked the jeweler to engrave that. I laughed, then cried, then laughed again. Grief is strange like that. It doesn't arrive neatly. It comes in waves and never asks permission. When I finally opened the envelope, there wasn't a long letter, just 1 page. Linda had written, "Tom, if you're opening this," then something happened that I prayed never would. "Before you read anything else, promise me one thing. Don't let anger make your decisions. Let the truth do that instead." I folded the page. Read it twice. That was Linda, always pulling me back before I stepped too far. Under the letter was another folded sheet, this one, typed, no greeting, no signature, only 1 sentence. "Everything you need is on the drive." I looked at the flash drive. It suddenly felt heavier than it should. Back home, I plugged it into my old laptop. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a folder appeared. Its name was simple. Home inside were dozens of files, scanned documents, insurance records, tax returns, old property surveys, everything Linda had quietly digitized over the years. I frowned. Linda hated computers. She used to ask me how to print an email. So, who scanned all of this? Then I remembered. 3 years before she died, she'd taken a free computer class at the public library. She joked she wanted to become dangerously modern. I smiled. She wasn't learning computers. She was protecting us. I clicked through the files: insurance, utilities, receipts, mortgage payoff. Then, 1 folder caught my eye. Power of attorney. My stomach tightened. Inside were 2 PDFs. One was the document I remembered signing. The other I had never seen before. It carried the exact same date, the exact same witness, the exact same notary, but it wasn't the same document. It expanded the powers massively: property transfers, financial authority, loans, real estate, business negotiations. Everything. I leaned closer, compared the pages. The signatures were mine, but the formatting was different. Different margins, different page numbers, different font. One document ended on page 4. The other started on page 5. It suddenly hit me. I hadn't signed 2 documents. I'd signed 1 stack, and someone had changed what was inside it. For weeks, I'd blamed myself, thought I'd been careless, thought I'd failed Linda, failed the house, failed my family. Now, for the first time, a different thought entered my mind. Maybe I hadn't been careless. Maybe I'd been deceived. Those are 2 very different things. Then I noticed one final file. It wasn't named, just a string of numbers. I opened it. It wasn't a document. It was security camera footage. The timestamp, 4 years old. The location, my own kitchen. I stared at the screen. There was Ethan, standing at the table, holding a stack of papers, and just before the video ended, he looked over his shoulder, made sure no one was watching, and quietly swapped the top pages. I froze, played it again, then again. There it was, clear as day. The moment my trust became his weapon. I reached for my phone, not to call Ethan, not yet. I called the only person who hadn't tried to tell me what I wanted to hear. Margaret. I know now. She was silent. Then she asked one question. Tom, what are you going to do? I looked back at the paused video, at my son's face, at the exact moment he chose deceit over family. For the first time since all of this began, I had an answer. I'm done defending him. The evidence could save my house or destroy my son. The hardest decision wasn't whether I could win. It was whether I could live with the cost of winning. Tom is no longer searching, he has proof. The audience's question changes from what happened to what will Tom do? The flash drive doesn't overwhelm viewers with legal jargon. Instead, it delivers one unforgettable image. Ethan swapping pages. That visual is far more memorable than pages of exposition, and it naturally launches the story into the moral conflict of the final chapters. Perfect. This is the highest retention chapter of the entire story. In revenge stories, revenge should never be the climax. Consequences should be. The audience doesn't actually want Tom to scream. They want Ethan to finally understand what he's destroyed. That emotional payoff is much stronger. So Chapter 9 becomes the collapse, not of Tom, of Ethan's carefully built life. People imagine revenge feels exciting, like fireworks, like winning. They're wrong. Real revenge, if you can even call it that, feels quiet. Because by the time the truth finally catches up to someone, you're usually too tired to celebrate. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't post anything online. I didn't send angry messages to the family. For 15 years, silence had protected him. I wasn't going to break that silence with shouting. I was going to break it with the truth. The next morning, I drove to Columbus, not to confront my son, to see a lawyer. Margaret insisted on coming. She didn't say much during the drive. Just once, she reached over, patted my arm, and quietly said, "Linda would be proud of you." I looked out the window. I hope someday Ethan can say the same. Neither of us spoke after that. The attorney's office overlooked downtown. Books everywhere. Quiet, the kind of place where people came carrying problems too heavy to solve alone. The lawyer watched the footage, read every document, compared both versions of the power of attorney. He didn't interrupt, didn't speculate, didn't rush. Nearly an hour later, he closed the folder, looked directly at me. "Mr. Bennett, did your son know about this evidence?" "No." He nodded slowly. "Good." That single word surprised me. Then he explained. If this video is authentic, this isn't simply a family disagreement, it's fraud. The room suddenly felt smaller. Fraud. I'd spent weeks thinking about betrayal. I hadn't allowed myself to think about crime. The lawyer leaned back. I'm going to ask you something, and I don't want you to answer immediately. He folded his hands. What outcome do you actually want? Not, can you win? Not, how much money did you lose? What outcome do you want? I realized no one had asked me that. Not once. I sat there thinking, longer than anyone expected. Finally, I answered, I don't want revenge. I want the truth to become impossible to hide. The lawyer smiled. Very slightly. That's a much better goal. Over the next 3 weeks, letters were sent, records were requested, the bank produced documents, the county released filings, the notary was interviewed. Piece by piece, the story stopped being mine. It became evidence, and evidence doesn't care who your father is or your son. Then, something happened I never expected. Ethan called, not because of me, because investigators had contacted him. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow. Dad, they're asking questions. I waited. I know. Another silence. I never thought, he whispered, it would get this far. That sentence stayed with me. Not, I never should have done it. I never thought I'd be held accountable. Those aren't the same thing. For the first time, Ethan cried, real crying. Not the careful kind. Not the kind people use to end an argument. The kind that comes from realizing the future you planned no longer exists. My company, my reputation, everything's falling apart. I listened. Then I quietly asked, do you remember the robin? Silence when you were 12. The one with the broken wing. I heard him inhale sharply. You cried for 2 weeks because you couldn't bear watching something helpless suffer. Another long silence. Then I asked the only question that mattered. So tell me, Ethan, when did that boy disappear? He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. A few days later, Danny came to see me. Neither of us touched the machines. He looked exhausted. I've never seen Dad like this. I nodded. He keeps saying he wishes he could go back. I smiled sadly. Everyone wishes that once yesterday finally sends the bill. Danny looked down. Do you hate him? That question deserved an honest answer. I thought about it, longer than he expected. Then I quietly said, no, I hate what he chose. There's a difference. Danny wiped his eyes. I hope he figures that out. So do I. A week later, the lawyer called. His first words were, Tom, the judge has scheduled a hearing. Then he paused. And there's something else. Ethan wants to speak to you. Alone, no lawyers, no family, just the two of you. After 15 years, my son was finally asking for something he couldn't buy. A conversation. When I walked into that room, I thought my son wanted forgiveness. I was wrong. What he asked for instead changed the ending of our story forever. The audience has already seen the evidence. Now they want to know, will Tom destroy Ethan? Will Ethan finally admit what he did? Can a father hold someone accountable without losing himself? Ending with a private meeting is far more compelling than ending with a courtroom scene, because viewers instinctively want to hear the conversation they've been waiting for since Chapter 1. It promises emotional resolution, not just legal resolution, and that's what keeps people watching into the finale. Now we're at the most important chapter in the entire story, and this is where almost every revenge story channel loses viewers. They end with a judge yelling, a huge lawsuit, the son going to prison, everybody clapping. That's satisfying for about 30 seconds. It is not memorable. The best dad revenge stories don't end with punishment. They end with a sentence the audience remembers for years. They end with dignity. They end with emotional justice, not cinematic justice. So let's finish this like a premium storyteller. People assume every story has two endings, one where the good guy wins and one where the bad guy loses. Life isn't built that way. Sometimes the hardest victory is refusing to become the person who hurt you. 3 days after my lawyer called, I met Ethan, not in a courtroom, not at his office. He asked to meet at the old park where he'd learned to ride a bicycle. I almost laughed when I pulled into the parking lot. The swing set had been replaced. The basketball court had fresh paint. The trees were taller. Funny how places keep growing, even when families stop. Ethan was already sitting on a bench. For a second, I barely recognized him. His suit was gone. No expensive watch, no polished shoes, no confident smile. He looked tired, older than the few weeks that had passed. I sat beside him. Neither of us spoke. Sometimes, silence says everything words can't. Finally, he broke it. I'm sorry. 2 words. The words I'd imagined hearing for 15 years. Strange thing is, when they finally arrived, they didn't feel like I'd imagined. Because apologies don't erase memories, they only acknowledge them. I've replayed it 1,000 times. He said quietly, the paperwork, the house, the lies. I kept telling myself, I'd fix everything before you ever found out. I looked at him. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. He lowered his head. I know. That was the first completely honest sentence I'd heard from him in years. A little boy rode past us on a bicycle. His father jogged beside him, one hand lightly holding the seat. Don't let go. The little boy shouted. The father smiled. I already did. The boy kept riding, without realizing he was doing it alone. Ethan watched them disappear down the path. Very quietly, he whispered, I used to think you'd always be there. I nodded. I was. You just stopped looking. He started crying again. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect another chance. I don't want Danny to remember me the way I'll always remember myself. That sentence broke something inside me. Not because it excused him, because for the first time, he wasn't grieving the investigation or the company or the money. He was grieving the man he'd become. And that's a heavier punishment than any judge can hand down. The hearing happened 2 weeks later. The evidence was overwhelming. The altered paperwork, the surveillance footage, the financial trail, the false representations. Before the judge ruled, Ethan stood. He admitted everything. Not because he had negotiated a better outcome. Because, he said, I've spent 15 years hiding from one lie. I'm done hiding. The courtroom was completely silent. The legal consequences followed. The fraudulent transfers were unwound. The sale was voided. My ownership was restored. His company was dismantled. He lost licenses, paid restitution, performed community service as part of the settlement. His reputation never fully recovered. People often ask me, if you won your house back, no, the house came back on paper. But time doesn't. Linda still wasn't waiting in the kitchen. The wallpaper she'd picked was gone. The garden she'd planted had been replaced. Some things, even justice cannot restore. Danny still comes every Saturday. He's learning the shop now, not because he has to, because he wants to. Sometimes, he asks me to tell stories about his grandmother. Sometimes, turns out, silence can heal just as easily as it can wound. As for Ethan, carefully, honestly, trust grows back slower than trees, but unlike lies, at least it grows in the right direction. Do you remember what I told you at the very beginning? I said my grandson found me before he ever thought to pick up a phone. That part is still true. But here's the part I didn't tell you. A few months later, Danny stopped by the shop after school, held up his phone, smiled, and said, "Grandpa, I don't need Google anymore. I know where to find you. Some people spend their whole lives chasing revenge. I spent mine finding my way back to family. Just not the family I thought I'd end up with."